Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the channel. And today I'm going to be doing my final election predictions for the 2024 election cycle. So we're going to start with the presidency, then the Senate, and then the House of Representatives. Before I start, I'd like to say if you like my content, subscribe to the channel and turn on the notification bell so you know when we upload, and also leave a like and comment because after the election results do come in, I'm going to make a video going over the results and saying where my predictions were right and wrong and why. And with all that said, let's get right into it. So, as always, I'm going to start with the solid states for Donald Trump, and those are going to be Montana, Idaho, Utah, Wyoming, North and South Dakota, Nebraska's 1st and 3rd congressional districts, as well as Nebraska at large, Kansas, Oklahoma, Missouri, Iowa, Arkansas, Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, Tennessee, Kentucky, Indiana, West Virginia, and South Carolina. As for the solid states for Kamala Harris, we have Washington, Oregon, California, Hawaii, New Mexico, and Colorado, Illinois, Maryland, Delaware, New Jersey, New York, Connecticut, Rhode Island, Massachusetts, Vermont, and the District of Columbia, as well as Maine's 1st congressional district. So, next up, I'm going to fill in the likely states for Donald Trump, starting with the state of Alaska. Alaska is a state that's been trending towards Democrats really since 2008. In 2008, John McCain won the state by a very wide margin. In 2012, Mitt Romney won it by a smaller margin. And in 2016 and 2020, that margin decreased. Trump only won it by around 10 points in 2020. In 2022, Alaska elected the first Democrat statewide in several decades, and she was reelected in the general election, Mary Peltola in the House of Representatives. So Alaska is trending towards Democrats, but Donald Trump is still going to win the state, probably by around 8 to 9 points. So I am going to call it likely Republican. Next up is going to be the state of Texas. Texas is another state that has been trending towards Democrats for about a decade now. In 2012, Mitt Romney won it by over 10 points, and then in 2016, Donald Trump only won it by around 9 points. Then in 2020, Donald Trump won it by a little bit less than 6 points. But it's important to note that in 2020, it was expected to be a lot closer because of certain trends in the suburbs and among Hispanic voters. But Donald Trump ended up winning it by a larger margin because Hispanic voters actually trended towards him in 2020. And so all of Southern Texas trended towards him in that election. Now, with the border being a huge issue in Texas, and with Hispanic trends probably going to accelerate in this election, even though the suburbs probably are going to turn against him again in this election, I do think he's going to hang on to Texas by a pretty large margin. So I am calling it likely Republican. Next up is going to be the state of Ohio. Ohio is a state that Obama won twice, both in 2008 and 2012. And then in 2016, Donald Trump flipped it by a very wide margin. He won it by around 8 points. Then in 2020, it was expected to be very close again, but then Trump ended up winning it by 8 points again. And that's because Ohio has just become a redder state. And that's because Donald Trump does a lot better than other Republicans with white working class voters, which makes up a lot of Ohio. So the rural areas of Ohio have trended a lot towards Republicans and Trump in particular. So I do think he's going to win Ohio by a large margin again. So I am calling it likely Republican. Next up is going to be the state of Florida. Florida is a state that has been clearly trending towards the GOP in recent years. In 2016, Donald Trump very narrowly won it against Hillary Clinton. And then in 2020, it was expected to flip back to Biden by a couple points, but it was very shocking on election night when Florida's results came in, and it was even more Republican than it was in 2016. And it went against the national trend in 2020. Trump won it by around 3.5 points. Then in the 2022 midterms, Ron DeSantis, the governor of Florida, who barely eked out a win in 2018, won re-election by over 19 points. I do expect Florida to stay in the single digits, but I do think that Trump is going to do really well in Florida. I think he's probably going to win it by around 8 to 9 points, so I am going to call it likely Republican. Finally, I'm going to fill in Maine's 2nd congressional district. Much like Ohio, Maine's 2nd congressional district is very white and very working class, and Obama won it twice by very large margins. Then in 2016, Donald Trump won it by around 10 points. Then in 2020, Maine as a whole trended towards the Democrats, and that included Maine's 2nd congressional district. Trump won it by around 7. I'm expecting him to win it by a similar margin this time, so I am calling it likely Republican. So next, I'm going to fill in the likely states for Kamala Harris, starting with the state of Minnesota. Minnesota is easily the furthest left of the big Rust Belt states. In 2016, Donald Trump almost won it because of high third party turnout. So Hillary Clinton won it by a little more than a point. That caused a lot of people to expect it to be competitive in 2020. And then Joe Biden ended up winning it by over 7 points over Trump. This election, it hasn't been seriously contested. No one's really talked about it as a swing state. It might have been closer if there was a lot of third party turnout, like if RFK had stayed in the race, but RFK dropped out and, of course, endorsed Donald Trump and joined his team. So I do think that Minnesota is going to be a large margin of victory for Kamala Harris. It might be a little bit less than 2020, but I do still think it's going to be above 5 points. So I'm going to call it likely Democrat. Next up is going to be Nebraska's second congressional district. This is a district that has been trending very much towards Democrats. In 2016, Donald Trump very narrowly won Nebraska's second congressional district. Then in 2020, he lost it by 6.5 against Joe Biden. And that's because it is very suburban. It's Omaha and its suburbs. And so the suburbs really across the country have been trending against Republicans and against Donald Trump. That happened in 2020. And so he went from winning it narrowly to losing it by a lot. I do expect suburban trends to continue. I don't think it's going to be as large as a swing from 2016 to 2020. So I do think that Donald Trump is going to lose this district again, probably by a bigger margin. It would probably be solid Democrat, except for the fact that during the 2022 redistricting process, the district did get a little bit redder. So I don't think it's going to be a double digit win for Kamala Harris, but I think she's going to win it convincingly. So I'm calling it likely Democrat. Next up is going to be the state of Virginia. And Virginia is another state that in recent years has trended towards Democrats. It used to be pretty solidly Republican. And then in 2008, Obama flipped it against McCain, and it hasn't voted for a Republican since then. However, in 2016, when Hillary Clinton picked Tim Kaine, the senator from Virginia, as her running mate, she only won the state by around 5 points. But then in 2020, Biden won it by over 10 points. And so a lot of people didn't really expect it to be competitive at all in this election. Then in 2021, Virginia elected Republican Glenn Youngkin as governor in what was considered to be a minor upset. And in 2022, despite the fact that the red wave did not materialize, Republicans did relatively well in Virginia. And so it was considered kind of a long shot flip for Donald Trump in this election, but it doesn't look like it's going to really be that close. I do think it's going to get closer from 2020. I still think Kamala Harris is probably going to win it by around 8 points. So I am calling Virginia likely Democrat. Next up is going to be the state of New Hampshire. New Hampshire used to be a pretty important swing state. Even though it's small, it was very important. Candidates visited it a lot. In more recent years, it has been a lot more Democratic on the federal level, as two Democratic senators. In 2016, Hillary Clinton narrowly eked out a win in New Hampshire. And then in 2020, Joe Biden won it by over 7 points. I do think New Hampshire is probably going to be around the same margin in 2024. So I am calling it likely Democrat. And finally, we're going to head over to neighboring Maine. Maine is a state that since the 90s has been very blue. Uh, a Republican has not won the state of Maine since 1988. In 2016, Hillary Clinton very narrowly won the state. It was about 2 points, which was pretty narrow for the state of Maine. Then in 2020, Joe Biden won it by around 9 points. Again, I'm expecting it to be pretty similar to 2020 this election, so I am calling it likely Democrat. So now it comes down to these 7 swing states, the big 7 swing states that have been important all cycle long. I'm going to go from west to east, filling them all in, starting with the state of Nevada. So, Nevada is a state that has been trending towards Republicans in recent years. Obama won it by a large margin in 2008, then by a smaller margin in 2012. Then against Donald Trump, Hillary Clinton only won it by around 2.4% in 2016, which was a big shift from 2012. Then in 2020, Joe Biden won it by almost the exact same margin as Hillary Clinton, but very slightly less in a year where the nation as a whole trended away from Republicans. And so that really was a sign that Nevada has started trending towards Republicans long term. In 2022, Republicans were expected to flip the governor race and the Senate race. However, Republicans underperformed polls, and they did still end up flipping the governor race, but the Senate race very, very narrowly went to the Democrat Catherine Cortez Masto. And the reason for that is because Clark County, which is the population center of Nevada, that's where Las Vegas is, has been trending towards Republicans. The main thing offsetting this is actually Washoe County up in the northwest of Nevada, which is where Reno is, and that has been trending towards Democrats. Right now, Donald Trump is very, very narrowly leading the Real Clear Politics average in Nevada. He's leading it by less than a point. And historically, with the exception of 2020, polls have underestimated Democrats in Nevada. So I do think that Kamala Harris is very narrowly going to win Nevada. Even though it is trending towards Republicans, I think she's still going to hang on narrowly in 2024. So I am calling it tilt Democrat. Next up is going to be the state of Arizona. When Biden won the state of Arizona very narrowly in 2020, I kind of expected that to be the beginning of Arizona's transformation into a solidly blue state. But for the most part, Arizona has actually looked like Trump's best swing state this cycle, even when Biden was still in the race. And a big reason that Arizona has been trending towards Democrats is because of the suburban trends I mentioned earlier in Phoenix and Maricopa County. Uh, Biden was the first Democrat to win that since 1948. But because the border has become such a big issue in this election, it looks like Arizona actually is going to flip back to Republicans. Right now, Donald Trump is leading by 2.6% in the Real Clear Politics average, which is his largest polling lead in any swing state. I do think he's going to win the state of Arizona. I think he's going to flip it back. I think he's probably going to win it by very slightly more than 2 points, so I am going to call it lean Republican. Next up is going to be the state of Wisconsin. Now, Wisconsin is a state that used to be very deeply blue. It hadn't gone to a Republican since 1984 in Reagan's 49 state landslide until Trump very narrowly flipped it against Hillary Clinton in 2016 when he won it by around zero point 0.8. Then in 2020, Joe Biden flipped it back by a 0.6% margin. So Wisconsin has been very close the last couple of elections. I expect it to be close again. Right now, Harris is leading in the Real Clear Politics average by 0.4%. In 2016 and 2020, Hillary Clinton and Joe Biden were both up by over 6 points in the averages. And then Hillary Clinton ended up losing it, and Biden barely squeaked by. So historically, Donald Trump has been underestimated by a lot in Wisconsin polling. I don't think it's going to be that severe this time because I don't think the shy Trump voter is as shy as they were back in 2016 and 2020. However, I do think that there is still just an area in Wisconsin that is good for Trump that just doesn't get counted in the polls. And so I do think he's very narrowly going to win Wisconsin. So I am calling Wisconsin tilt Republican. Next up is going to be the state of Michigan. And Michigan's another state that was blue for a very long time. In 2008, Obama won it by around 15 points. Then in 2012, he won it by around 9. Then in 2016, Michigan was the big shock of the cycle when Trump very narrowly flipped it by less than half a point. And then in 2020, Joe Biden flipped it back by almost 3 points. Right now, Kamala Harris is up in the polling average by zero point 0.6 in Michigan. But two of those polls in the average have Trump leading and are both Republican pollsters. So I do think Michigan is probably going to be a little bit bluer than the polls are showing. Overall, even though the economy is going to be a big issue in Michigan, I just don't see Trump being able to overcome the suburban trends in the state of Michigan. So I do think Kamala Harris is going to win the state of Michigan by a couple points. So I am going to call it lean Democrat. Next, we're going to look at the state of Georgia. Georgia very unexpectedly flipped to Joe Biden in 2020. That was the big surprise of that cycle. The last couple election cycles, it had narrowed up. So Trump won it by around 5 points in 2016. Romney had won it by 7 in 2012. So when Biden flipped it, it was a surprise, but it wasn't totally surprising because Georgia had been trending that way. And the reason for that was for a couple of reasons. One, the suburban trends that I've already mentioned several times in this video for other states that happened in Georgia too, but also Atlanta has been growing, and Atlanta has a very high population of black voters who turned out more than usual in 2020. And in this election, it does look like black turnout is going to be down. And so that is going to help Donald Trump in the state. Right now, in the Real Clear Politics average, Trump is up by 1.7 points in Georgia. And Georgia polls have actually been very accurate historically. In 2020, Biden was up very narrowly in Georgia, and he ended up winning the state very narrowly. In 2022, polls were off by a little bit. They had Herschel Walker winning narrowly, and then Raphael Warnock won by around a point in the first round. But Brian Kemp, the Republican governor, won by around 7 points, which is exactly what polls were showing. So polls in Georgia do tend to be very accurate. And for all the reasons I mentioned, I do think that Donald Trump is narrowly going to win Georgia. So I'm going to call it tilt Republican. Next up is going to be the state of North Carolina. And North Carolina is actually the only state of all of the toss ups that I had selected that Trump won in 2020. He won it by around a point and a half over Joe Biden. Right now, polls have it similarly close. He's up by 1.3 in the Real Clear Politics average. And I do think Trump is actually maybe in a little bit of trouble in North Carolina compared to the last couple cycles here, mostly because it's possible that the governor nominee, Mark Robinson, who we'll get to later in the governor prediction, um, will drag down the ticket. I do think that Trump is probably going to hang on, though, because North Carolina historically has gone to Republicans by tight margins, but always gone to Republicans. And Trump is up in the average right now. So I do think he's narrowly going to win North Carolina. I think it'll be by a similar margin to 2020. So I am just going to call it tilt Republican. Finally, we have the state of Pennsylvania. And Pennsylvania is another state that went for Obama twice in 2008 and 2012, then flipped to Trump narrowly in 2016, then flipped narrowly back to Biden in 2020. And right now, in the polling average on Real Clear Politics, Trump is up by 0.4%. However, a lot of those are Republican pollsters, or at least pollsters that typically favor Republicans, like Emerson, Atlas Intel, and Trafalgar. And there's a poll in there by Echelon that has Trump up 6 in Pennsylvania. Obviously, even if Trump wins Pennsylvania, he's not going to win it by 6. So there are some polls in there that are skewing the average more towards Trump. However, things do look good on the early voting side. Democrats had a firewall of about 500,000 that they wanted to reach to have a good shot in Pennsylvania, and they didn't reach that. They only reached a little under 400,000. However, Trump's suburban problem is going to affect him in Pennsylvania. There are several large areas of suburbs in the state, namely around Philadelphia and Pittsburgh. And even though he's narrowly up in the polls right now, I do think that his rural gains that he's probably going to make are not going to offset the suburban gains that Kamala Harris will make. I think it's going to be a little closer than 2020, but I do still think that Harris is going to win the state of Pennsylvania, so I am going to call it tilt Democrat. So, with all 50 states filled in, we have Donald Trump very, very narrowly winning re-election to a second non-consecutive term with 272 electoral votes to Vice President Kamala Harris's 266. I have Donald Trump flipping a couple states that Joe Biden won in 2020, including Wisconsin, Georgia, and Arizona. I have him holding on to North Carolina. I have Kamala Harris holding on to Nevada, Michigan, and Pennsylvania. Overall, if the polls are right in this election, which they seldom are, but if they're right, then Donald Trump is going to win this election. In fact, the map will be a little different. He wouldn't win Wisconsin, but he would win Pennsylvania and Nevada. I do think that there is going to be some polling error here and there, but I do still think that Trump is going to win overall. If Donald Trump loses and Kamala Harris wins, the reason for that is going to be suburban trends that have been happening really since Donald Trump became president the first time. And it could also be because women are energized still because of Roe v. Wade being overturned. That's what sunk Republicans in the midterms. The effect on that probably isn't going to be as strong as it was 2 years ago because it's not as recent. But if Kamala Harris does eke out a win, that will definitely be part of it. The top three states that I'm least confident in my predictions in are Pennsylvania because of the facts I mentioned about early voting looking good and the fact that Trump is up in the polls right now. Wisconsin, just because the polling error in Wisconsin can be kind of unpredictable, and North Carolina because of trends in the state, plus the fact that it looks like the governor race could sink Trump here. So overall, I wouldn't be surprised if my toss-up state predictions are off in certain areas, but this is my final prediction when I go state by state. So next, I'm going to do my final Senate prediction, and so I'm going to start like I usually do, fill in the solid Republican states. Those are going to be Utah, Wyoming, North Dakota, Nebraska special election, Missouri, Mississippi, Tennessee, Indiana, and West Virginia. And as for the solid states for the Democrats, those are going to be Washington, California, Hawaii, New Mexico, Virginia, Maryland, Delaware, New Jersey, New York, Connecticut, Rhode Island, Massachusetts, Vermont, and Maine, as well as Minnesota. And Vermont and Maine are technically independents, Bernie Sanders and Angus King, but they caucus with the Democrats. So for simplicity's sake, I'm just going to keep them blue on the map. Next, I'm going to fill in the likely states for Republicans, starting with the state of Montana. Montana is currently held by Democrat John Tester, who is on his third term, running for a fourth term in the Senate. But because this is a presidential year and polarization has gotten so bad in this country, it looks like regardless of whether he's a good senator or not, I'm not going to give an opinion on that, but he is down by 7.2 points in the polls. Trump is probably going to win Montana by a very, very large margin. So I'd actually be surprised if Tester even does that well against his opponent Tim Sheehy. This race looked competitive at the beginning because Tester was the incumbent and had high name recognition, but ultimately polarization caught up to him, and he is probably going to go down by several points. So I am calling Montana likely Republican. Next up is going to be Nebraska's regularly scheduled Senate election. This is Deb Fischer, the incumbent Republican, running for another term. And at first, no one really thought Nebraska was going to be competitive at all. But instead of a Democrat running, an independent ran to closer to the center instead of to the left. And that has made Nebraska a little bit close because Deb Fischer got lazy with her campaigning. Right now, on the 538 average, Fischer is only up by 2.5 points over the independent Dan Osborne. I don't think it's going to be that close. I think that's mostly just polling error because Usually, Nebraska doesn't have to be polled because it's such a safe Republican state. However, this race is going to be closer than the presidential race, I assume. So I am calling it likely Republican, but it's not going to be as close as polls say. Next up is going to be the state of Florida. Florida is currently held by incumbent Republican Rick Scott, who won in a minor upset in 2018 over three-term incumbent Bill Nelson. He won by a very, very small margin, less than a point. Now, since Florida has been trending so much towards Republicans in that time, and it's a presidential year, and he's up by almost 5 points in the Senate average or in the Real Clear Politics average, I do think that Rick Scott is going to win by several points in Florida. He'll probably underperform Trump by a couple, but I think he'll probably win by around 6 points. So I am calling Florida likely Republican. Next up are going to be the likely Democrat states, starting with the state of Nevada. Nevada was expected to be a competitive Senate race going into this cycle. Jackie Rosen seems to be a lot stronger than expected. Right now, she's up by 5 in the Real Clear Politics average over her opponent, Sam Brown. He just seems to be kind of a weak candidate in Nevada, so it looks like she's going to outperform Kamala Harris by several points. I do think that she'll win by over 5 points, so I am calling Nevada likely Democrat. And next up is going to be the state of Arizona. Despite the fact I do think this is going to be Trump's best swing state on the presidential level, Carrie Lake really is just a terrible candidate for the Senate. Gallego has been leading the entire cycle, and it's narrowed up a little bit recently. He's up by 3.6 in the Real Clear Politics average, but for most of the cycle, he was up by over 5 points. And honestly, I do still think he's going to win by over 5 points because Carrie Lake seems pretty toxic, and I don't think independents are going to break for her, especially after her behavior following her loss in the 2022 governor election to Katie Hobbs. And again, Arizona has been trending towards Democrats. Trump just seems to have bucked this trend just for this election because of the border issue. So I do think Ruben Gallego is going to win by over 5 points. So I am calling Arizona likely Democrat. So now we are down to 5 toss up Senate races. Republicans will need 50 if Trump wins or 51 if Kamala Harris wins to take control of the Senate. So I'm going to fill in these toss up states west to east, starting with the state of Texas. So this Senate seat is currently held by Ted Cruz, who people probably remember ran for president in 2016. He was reelected to the Senate in 2018 by a very narrow margin over Beto O'Rourke, and that is what fueled a lot of people to think that Texas was maybe going to flip in 2020 if Joe Biden had a really good night. Ultimately, Texas did not flip in 2020, like I mentioned, and Ted Cruz won narrowly over O'Rourke in 2018. Right now, Real Clear Politics polling average in the state of Texas has Cruz up by 4.4. I have Trump winning the state by a likely margin. I do think that Cruz is going to outperform his 2018 number against Colin Allred. So I am going to call Texas lean Republican. Next up is going to be the state of Wisconsin. And on the presidential level, I do have Trump winning this state very narrowly. This Senate election was one that I didn't really expect to be competitive at the beginning of the cycle. I thought that Tammy Baldwin was a pretty strong incumbent, especially after Ron Johnson barely squeaked by in 2022. I thought that Baldwin was probably safe, but it turns out that her opponent, Eric Hovde, has run a good campaign against her. And in the Real Clear Politics average, Baldwin is only up by 1.8%, which is very narrow. And even though that is a narrow lead, it's a very consistent lead. There's only one poll in the entire average that has Hovde leading. All the other ones are Baldwin leads, and they're all narrow, but it does look like she's clearly favored here. I think it's going to be really close, but I do think that Baldwin is narrowly going to hang on. I think that she's going to outperform Kamala Harris, so I am calling Wisconsin tilt Democrat. Next up is going to be the state of Michigan, and on the presidential level, I do have Kamala Harris winning this one by a lean margin. This one's between Alyssa Slotkin, who is currently in the House of Representatives and she's running for Senate now, and Mike Rogers, who is a former Republican congressman from Michigan. And at first, I thought Mike Rogers was going to be a good candidate in Michigan, but his campaign has been kind of lazy. He hasn't been campaigning very well. Slotkin is a known name in Michigan because she is a congresswoman from the state. Right now, Slotkin's up by 2.3 in the Real Clear Politics average. I do think she's going to win this race by a couple points, and so I'm calling it lean Democrat. Next up is going to be the state of Ohio, and this one is currently held by Democrat Sherrod Brown, who won re-election to a third term in 2018 in the Blue Wave midterm year. For most of this cycle, he has been leading the polling average. Very recently, the average did flip to Bernie Moreno, his Republican opponent. Moreno currently is leading the average by around 1 point. Even if Moreno wasn't leading the average, I still think that he was going to win this Senate race because Ohio has become such a Republican state, and I'm expecting Donald Trump to win it by a large margin, close to or maybe exceeding his margins from 2016 and 2020. And I'm not expecting that much ticket splitting. So I do think that Bernie Moreno is going to flip Ohio. So I'm going to call it lean Republican. Finally, we have the state of Pennsylvania, and this is another one where, just like Wisconsin, I thought that Casey was unbeatable going into this election cycle. I thought that his name alone was going to carry him to a large victory over whoever his opponent was. His opponent ended up being Republican businessman Dave McCormick, and it actually has become a very tight race. Right now, in the Real Clear Politics average, Casey's only up by 1.8 points, but a lot like the Wisconsin Senate race, most of those polls do have Casey leading. There's only a couple that have McCormick leading. All the other ones are narrow Casey leads. I think just because of his incumbency and his name recognition, Casey is going to pull this off, but it was a lot closer than I was expecting at the beginning of this cycle. So I am going to call it lean Democrat. I think Casey will probably win by around 2 points, but it's a lot closer than I initially thought. So now, with all of the Senate seats filled in, I have Republicans flipping the Senate back 52 to 48. I have them flipping West Virginia, which I didn't even mention because it's so solidly red, Montana, and Ohio, and everything else holding for their respective parties. There is a chance that Wisconsin and Pennsylvania or Pennsylvania flip to Republicans, and there's also a chance that Sherrod Brown does hold on in Ohio. Those are the three states that I'm kind of most unsure about, but for the most part, I do feel pretty confident in this prediction because the Senate didn't end up having too many unpredictable races this year. So now I'm going to fill in the governor races. There are only 11 governor races and only a couple competitive ones. So I'm going to start with the solid Republican states. Those are going to be Montana, Utah, North Dakota, Missouri, West Virginia, and Vermont. Vermont, obviously a very deep blue state, but has a very popular Republican governor who is going to win easily. As for the solid Democrat states, those are going to be Washington and Delaware. Now I'm going to fill in the likely states, of which there's only one. It's going to be likely Republican, and it's going to be the state of Indiana. Indiana is a very Republican state. Donald Trump's going to win it easily by double digits. However, on the governor level, typically these races are closer. Uh, Current Senator Mike Braun is running for governor this year, and currently he's up by 9 in the Real Clear Politics average. He's going to win easily, I think, but it's going to be a single digit win, so I am calling it likely Republican. And I actually totally lied because I forgot about North Carolina, but that's going to be likely Democrat. And I mentioned in the presidential prediction that it's possible that Mark Robinson, the Republican nominee, is going to sink Trump here. Right now, Stein, the Democrat, is up by 14 points in the Real Clear Politics average. And if Stein wins by 14 points, it's really hard for me to see Donald Trump pulling off the state. However, typically, I don't believe in reverse coattails. I feel like it's more likely the presidential race would affect the governor race than vice versa. So I do think it's going to be a smaller margin than 14 points. I think Stein is going to win by high single digits. So I am calling it likely Democrat and not solid Democrat. But Robinson has been such a controversial and bad candidate that there's going to be a lot of ticket splitting in this race, much more than any other race probably in the country. So I am calling North Carolina likely Democrat on the governor. Finally, we have our only competitive governor race of the cycle, and that is going to be New Hampshire. New Hampshire has become a bluer state on the federal level, as I mentioned in the presidential election prediction, and it has two Democratic senators, but it always tends to elect Republicans as governor. Chris Sununu is the current governor. He's retiring this cycle, but he is on his fourth term. New Hampshire does 2-year terms. So he's been governor since 2016 and he's retiring this time. And Kelly Ayotte, the former senator who actually lost in 2016, is running for governor now against Joyce Craig. And she's up by around 2.5 points in the average in New Hampshire. I do think she's going to pull off the New Hampshire governor election, so I am calling it lean Republican. So that is all of the governor's races filled in. And this map doesn't actually show the total amount of governors, but all of these races are actually filled in according to how they currently are. So there's no change in any of these races. That would make the lineup of governors next time the exact same partisan composition as it was before the election: 27 Republicans and 23 Democrats. And finally, I'm not going to go into a ton of detail here because there's so many competitive races, but we have the House of Representatives. If you want to pause and look at these, go ahead and comment on it in the comments because I will talk about it. But currently, I have Republicans taking 219 seats and Democrats taking 216. Uh, these are all so close, and there's so many toss-up races that really I could see the House going either way. I went uh, seat by seat. I tried to be unbiased, and this is what I came up with. but really, I could see it going either way. I wouldn't be surprised if Democrats won. So technically, I am predicting a Republican trifecta after the 2024 election because I have Trump narrowly winning, I have the Senate flipping, and I have Republicans holding on to the House of Representatives. But the presidency and House are so close that I really wouldn't be surprised if either of them went to the other party. But anyway, guys, thank you so much for watching this video. If you like my content, subscribe to the channel and turn on the notification bell so you know when we upload. Also, leave a like and comment. I am going to make a video about the results and compare them to my predictions after all of the results are in. Thank you guys so much for watching the channel this election cycle. We've grown a lot in the last year or so, so I really appreciate it. And happy election day, everyone. And thank you so much for watching. And have a great day.